On November 24th, 1991, the world didn't wake up to a scream. It woke up to a statement, a short announcement, carefully worded, clinical, final. Freddie Mercury was dead. Just 24 hours earlier, he had publicly confirmed what the press had whispered for years, that he was living with AIDS. And then, almost immediately, he was gone. No long farewell tour, no dramatic hospital footage, no final concert. The man who had commanded Wembley Stadium with a single note disappeared in silence. For millions, the shock wasn't just his death. It was the speed, the contrast, the impossibility of imagining that voice, that defiant, theatrical, untouchable voice, could simply stop. Television channels interrupted programming. Radio stations replayed Bohemian Rhapsody on loop. Outside his home in Kensington, fans gathered with candles, flowers, and disbelief. This wasn't just the loss of a rock singer. It felt like the collapse of something larger, a presence that had once seemed indestructible. Freddie Mercury was not subtle. He was explosive, dramatic, unapologetically grand. He strutted across stages in white tank tops and military jackets as if gravity answered to him. He didn't just perform songs, he conquered arenas. And yet, in his final months, he retreated almost completely from the public eye. Rumors swirled, tabloids speculated, but no one outside his inner circle understood how close the end really was. The shock of November 24th wasn't only grief, it was realization. The realization that even the most powerful stage personas are human beneath the spotlight. How does someone who seemed larger than life vanish in less than a day? To answer that, we have to go back to before Freddie Mercury existed, to a boy who didn't yet know he would one day command the world. Long before stadium lights, before crowns and capes, before the name the world would chant, he was Farrokh Bulsara, a quiet boy born on September 5th, 1946 in Zanzibar. There were no guitars echoing through royal halls, no roaring crowds, just a colonial island off the coast of East Africa and a Parsi family trying to build stability in a shifting world. He was sent away to boarding school in India at a young age, separated early from home, a detail small on paper but heavy in childhood. At St. Peter's School in Panchgani, Farrokh learned discipline, English manners, and music. He was shy, observant, slightly different. His buck teeth made him self-conscious. His classmates would later remember two things: his ability to draw and his refusal to blend in quietly. Even then, he didn't seem content with ordinary. It was at school that he formed his first band, the Hectics. He played piano. He sang. The seeds were planted not in rebellion but in imagination. Farrokh wasn't loud. He wasn't yet theatrical. But there was ambition, a quiet insistence that he would not remain small. When political unrest forced his family to flee Zanzibar in 1964, they relocated to England as immigrants. The move wasn't glamorous, it was survival. In London, he enrolled at Ealing Art College, studying graphic design. He absorbed British rock culture, fashion, visual aesthetics. Identity became fluid. Farrokh became Freddie. The change wasn't cosmetic, it was strategic. Names carry power, and Freddie Mercury sounded like someone destined for the stage. He wasn't yet a global icon. He was a student sketching album covers, observing performers, studying how presence works. The boy who once felt out of place was constructing a new self, one deliberate, bold, impossible to ignore. Freddie Mercury didn't appear overnight. He was designed, layer by layer, by a young immigrant who refused to let the world define his size. Freddie Mercury did not stumble into stardom. He engineered it. When he joined the band that would become Queen, he wasn't just another vocalist, he was a transformation waiting to happen. The late 1960s London music scene was crowded with talent, but Freddie understood something others didn't. Music alone wasn't enough. Spectacle mattered, identity mattered, presence mattered. He convinced guitarist Brian May and drummer Roger Taylor that the band needed a new name, something regal, provocative, impossible to ignore. Queen was theatrical, ambiguous, defiant. It was everything Freddie intended to be. He didn't just sing, he constructed an experience. Early performances were experiments in persona. Leather, satin, dramatic gestures, microphone stands used like scepters. The shy art student was gone. In his place stood a frontman who commanded space with calculated flamboyance. Albums like A Night at the Opera proved his ambition had no ceiling. And then came Bohemian Rhapsody. 6 minutes of operatic rock that defied radio conventions and industry logic. Record executives were skeptical. Freddie was not. He believed the audience would follow grandeur if it was delivered with conviction. He was right. The song became a phenomenon, rewriting what a rock single could be. It wasn't just success, it was audacity rewarded. But the true coronation came in 1985 at Live Aid, in front of 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium and an estimated 1.9 billion watching worldwide. Freddie didn't perform. He dominated. 20 minutes. That's all he needed. From the first call and response note, he controlled the crowd like a conductor commanding an orchestra. Every clap, every chant followed his rhythm. It was not merely technical talent, it was authority. He seemed untouchable, immortal. In that moment, Freddie Mercury wasn't just a singer in a band, he was rock royalty. The myth was complete, yet myths are constructed illusions, larger than the person beneath them. Freddie had mastered reinvention. He had built a stage identity that radiated confidence, excess, and invulnerability. But maintaining a myth requires constant energy. It demands perfection under lights and resilience in private. By the mid-1980s, Queen had conquered continents. Freddie had achieved what few artists ever reach: global adoration and cultural permanence. The boy from Zanzibar had become a symbol, but symbols do not sleep. They perform, and sometimes the louder the applause, the harder it becomes to step off stage. By the mid-1980s, Freddie Mercury had become more than a frontman. He was an emblem of excess, of theatricality, of defiance. But the louder the persona grew, the smaller the room for privacy became. Fame at that scale does not knock politely. It intrudes. Tabloids tracked his movements. Headlines speculated about his relationships, his parties, his appearance. London nightlife became both playground and spectacle. The myth of Freddie, glamorous, untouchable, unstoppable, fed the press, and the press fed the myth. What the cameras captured were fragments: lavish gatherings, bold fashion, unapologetic confidence. What they didn't capture was the quiet negotiation of identity beneath it all. The 1980s were not forgiving to ambiguity. Discussions of sexuality were sensationalized rather than understood. Freddie rarely labeled himself publicly, preferring privacy over confession. That decision, powerful in its independence, also made him a target for speculation. Rumors intensified as his look changed: shorter hair, leather aesthetic, a harder edge replacing earlier flamboyance. Some fans resisted the shift. American radio stations briefly distanced themselves during certain eras. But Freddie did not dilute himself to maintain comfort. Reinvention was survival. He understood that icons must evolve or calcify, yet evolution under constant scrutiny is exhausting. Every shift becomes headline material. Every absence invites theory. Behind the scenes, Queen's internal dynamics were complex but disciplined. Unlike many rock bands imploding under ego and excess, the group maintained a structure that allowed creative friction without collapse. Freddie's perfectionism in the studio became legend. He would demand dozens of takes to chase a note that lived only in his imagination. Control on stage translated into control in sound. But control is not the same as protection. By the late 1980s, whispers about his health began circulating more aggressively in British tabloids. Photographs were analyzed. Weight loss became subject to column inches. The public appetite for information outpaced the truth available. And then there was isolation. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but incremental. When someone lives inside a persona that radiates invulnerability, vulnerability feels dangerous. Friends described Freddie as witty, sharp, affectionate, yet he also guarded his private world carefully. The mansion in Kensington became sanctuary and fortress. Fame provides access to anything money can buy, but it rarely provides anonymity. The man who could electrify 72,000 people in seconds increasingly withdrew from interviews and extended tours. Silence, for him, became a form of control. If the myth required spectacle, the man beneath it required space. The cost of being iconic is rarely paid in a single transaction. It accumulates. It shows up in late nights, in strained trust, in the weight of expectation that never switches off. Freddie Mercury had built a persona that seemed indestructible, but indestructibility is a performance. Beneath crowns and spotlights was a human navigating an era of intense stigma, relentless media hunger, and personal uncertainty. The world saw grandeur. What it could not see, was the toll exacted by maintaining it. And by the time whispers turned into something more serious, the myth had grown so large that imagining it falter felt almost impossible. On November 23, 1991, after years of speculation, denial, and guarded silence, Freddie Mercury released a public statement. It was brief, direct. He confirmed that he had been living with HIV and had developed AIDS. For years, tabloids had circled the rumor without proof. Now, in his own words, he removed ambiguity. It was not a dramatic press conference. There were no flashing cameras, just a written declaration delivered to the press. For someone who had spent decades controlling spectacle, this final announcement was stripped of performance. It was factual, human, final. Less than 24 hours later, on November 24, 1991, Freddie Mercury died at his home in Kensington, London, due to bronchial pneumonia resulting from AIDS. The speed stunned the world. Confirmation was followed almost immediately by loss. Radio stations pivoted into tribute mode. Television anchors adopted subdued tones. Fans who had processed the diagnosis barely had time to process the goodbye. The suddenness intensified grief. It felt as though the world had just been invited behind the curtain, only for it to close permanently. What followed was not scandal, but reverence. Outside Garden Lodge, flowers accumulated in layers. Handwritten notes thanked him for courage, for music, for freedom of expression. For many in the LGBTQ+ community, his final declaration carried weight beyond celebrity. In an era still saturated with stigma and misinformation about AIDS, his acknowledgement resonated as both vulnerability and defiance. He had not built his career on activism, yet in death, his visibility shifted public attention toward a crisis often shrouded in silence. In April 1992, the Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley Stadium brought together some of the biggest names in music. It was not a funeral in black. It was a celebration in sound. Artists stood where he once commanded the stage, not to replace him, but to honor him. The crowd sang lyrics he had made immortal. For a moment, the absence felt communal rather than isolating, but even celebration could not erase the finality. The voice that had once controlled stadiums would never return to the microphone. Freddie Mercury had spent a lifetime performing larger-than-life bravado. In the end, his final act was simple truth. No theatrics, no cape, just a statement and then silence. And in that silence, the world finally understood the human beneath the myth. When Freddie Mercury died, the body was gone, but the scale of his presence expanded. In the years that followed, Queen's music did not fade into nostalgia. It intensified. Stadiums still erupt when the opening piano of Bohemian Rhapsody begins. New generations chant Radio Gaga without ever having seen him live. His performances have become reference points, studied, replayed, measured against. Few frontmen command comparison without physical presence. Freddie does. His legacy is not simply about sales or chart positions. It is about permission. Permission to be theatrical in a genre that once prized restraint. Permission to blend opera with hard rock. Permission to exist outside rigid definitions of masculinity. In life, he built a persona larger than gravity. In death, that persona became timeless. Freddie Mercury once sang, "The show must go on." It did, not because he was replaceable, but because he had already embedded himself into the architecture of popular music. The microphone fell silent in 1991. The echo never did,